This first session this afternoon is entitled Opportunities. You might remember that the morning session was challenges, so now we're moving on to opportunities.
Did we accomplish the challenges?
No, we outlined the challenges so we can make use of the opportunities. How's that? First up is again Tom Burns. He's here to talk about consolidation and collaboration in secondary schools. Tom?
Okay, back again with the envious task of keeping people engaged after a bigger than normal lunch, right? So feel free to do calisthenics at any point in time. Last fall I did a version of this at the school board's convention in Rochester, and so this morning we talked about a lot of the difficulties and the challenges, and we want to focus a little bit on looking forward. What are some of the options our school districts might have? In 2010, the Rural Schools Association, a partner organization with Dr. Sippel's group at Cornell, did a countywide school consolidation study. It's a great study. Many of the schools have it on their websites. I believe it is still linked to our BOCES website. If it's not there and you need to get it, just contact the BOCES office in Canton. We can put it back up on the site or get you a copy. It's 317 pages, very detailed work. Dr. Larry Kiley and Dr. Dennis Sweeney. And so what most people do is flip to the executive summary, which I think is on page 15 and 16 of the 317 pages. And what I want to do is just run through the major recommendations that were made in the executive study. And I think these were the major recommendations at the time. The first piece, moving to regional cooperative business office services. So some of these things were just naturally already starting to occur and have continued. BOCES does offer a regional cooperative business office. At the time of the study, we had 6 districts that were participating. 3 years later, we now have 12 districts. We decided to offer sort of a la carte services in this regard, where the original 6 bought the entire business office service from us. But since then, we've evolved and allowed, if a district wants to just do payroll or just have an account clerk. So I think that explains some of the growth as well. We also started at the BOCES a regional food service management, which is supervisory only. Menu planning, the budgeting, et cetera. So we now have 5 school districts in that COSER. So again, these non-instructional areas, there's some potential for growth there, and we are seeing growth. The third bullet, we haven't started and really investigated this further, but what the consultants were calling for is having essentially a SWAT team for maintenance, and the specialized service that might come to mind would be boiler maintenance. A lot of the school districts have dated boiler systems. Could we do a regional approach where some specialized maintenance functions would be located, say, where the current BOCES CTE centers are, and each district would then not have to employ a specialized person in 18 different places, but they could rely on this service. So we haven't investigated that. The consultants decided in a county this size, the largest geographic county in the state, and when you compare us to other counties, other BOCES regions, we really are like 3 counties within a county. The consultants at that time said, whoa, this is way too big a chunk. You need to probably have another study done to look at regional transportation. And of course, cost factors into all of this. This particular study in 2010 was in the neighborhood of $125,000, which all 18 districts were able to share and receive BOCES aid on. But cost and time are a factor in when you heard Mr. Todd this morning and all the curriculum initiatives we have and our financial challenges to do more and more of these studies. Leveraging technology for instruction and efficiency. We've had a distance learning network at our BOCES, a robust one for many years. We continue to look at that and online possibilities, blended learning, flipped classrooms. And the first bullet on the right-hand side was something that they recommended to us at the time before knowing that Race to the Top and all of those state and federal initiatives would be coming. So that's kind of taken care of that piece for us. Mr. Todd talked about the Common Core and, of course, the teacher and principal APPR system. So that's all been state-driven, and we have had to follow through on all of those initiatives. And working with our elected officials on regional high schools, just to update you on the progress there, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, is the last 2 years, we have had 2 different pieces of legislation pass the New York State Senate. Who the Senate has supported regional high schools. There have been no companion bills in the Assembly. We really have tried to dig more deeply and see if there are political obstacles there, but we really haven't been able to determine that. So I'm not sure what's holding up progress in the Assembly, but we'll continue to talk with our elected officials about that. And then the last piece I think David Acker mentioned, which is just a very critical piece, about educating communities on what are some other options. And you're going to hear from Phil Martin next. We are doing a regional high school study in 3 of our component districts. But to just illustrate how much work we have to do in this area, I attended a regional high school forum in Herman DeKalb, one of the 3 schools looking at the study. And when we got to the Q&A at the end, mindful, of course, that the business manager had done a small presentation showing multi-year financing and showing how many more years the district could go to be solvent. And I think it was in the neighborhood of 4 years. And so one of the community members got up at the end and said, you know, semi-angry, why isn't one of the options that we remain autonomous and keep doing what we're doing? So I didn't respond. It wasn't my place. What I was thinking is, how's that working for you? Right? We know what the data was, excuse me, and where it was headed. So we've talked about regional high schools, and what's currently in law is what's commonly known as mergers, but really centralization of school districts. And I know John Sipple referred to this, and one of the things I thought I would do is just summarize for you the positives and the negatives. And while you're looking over the pros and cons, John spoke to the historical evolution of these pieces that we had over 11,000 school districts, roughly around the turn of the century, and we're down to 700. But the fact that we've seen very few centralizations in the last 50 years. In this BOCES region, of course, when you consider all of our school names, Madrid Waddington, Norwood Norfolk, Herman DeKalb, most of those centralizations occurred in the 1950s, most in the early 1950s. It's also interesting to hear people in those communities now say, we can't do that. They're all sitting in districts that did do that, 50 or 60 years ago. So it's just interesting. I do think it suggests, since we've had, a couple of handfuls of these mergers in the last 50 years, that maybe it's the mechanism. Maybe centralization legislation that was written in the late 1940s isn't quite applicable to what we need today. When John was talking about community effects, keep in mind that most of these centralizations, I was a Norwood Norfolk graduate, and in fact, my parents were the class of 1955. My mother was Norwood High School, my father was Norfolk High School. Yes, they're still speaking and still married. And so that district centralized in a brand new building in 1952 in the middle of those communities. Again, as John pointed out, not in either town, but you've got these centralized buildings. So again, maybe that mechanism is dated, and maybe that mechanism is not what's going to work moving forward. But you can see at least the pros and cons that are there. The other thing, just a corollary I'll add, is that when we have these discussions about regional high schools and mergers, most of our schools, of course, are small and rural. We have a number of districts that actually have fewer than 500 pupils in this BOCES. And so what I hear parents and community members often say in a very pained way is we can't let go of our small school. We can't. There's comfort in that smallness. But what I like to point out is there's no data whatsoever to show that smaller brings better academic results. It is incredibly mixed around the entire state. Smaller is not necessarily academically better. We have excellent small schools. We have some very poor small schools. We have some very excellent large school districts, Shenendehowa, 10,000 pupils, and we have some large districts that don't perform so well. So there's no correlation with school size and academic performance. Just a couple of points about mergers and why I think, again, they're not particularly working so well. We know about the whole school colors and the athletic rivalries with our next door neighbors. I've heard some very interesting things in this regard over the years. The most clever I've ever heard when I was a teacher in Jeff Lewis Bosse's, they referred to natural bridge as unnatural bridge. But here is a real impediment, a serious logistical impediment to mergers is the taxation rates. And it is true that you receive this 40% merger incentive aid. The most recent centralized district we have to demonstrate this is Edwards-Knox, which centralized in 1985, I believe. And when you look at the possibilities for our other districts on the far right-hand column and you see their true value tax rate, keep in mind that you're going to have to spend a certain amount of that incentive money just to level up the tax rates. And I think what has been suggested to me is that if those tax rates aren't within $2 or $3 of one another, then it may be out of bounds. All right, you may have to spend the entire allotment on incentive aid and still not be able to make the merged district scalable. So I would point out.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why do you need to make those equitable? Now, school districts cross political boundaries. There are different assessed valuations town to town, and people do pay different rates within the districts.
It's a great question. I think what it comes back to, Keith, is that to get any of this done again under this format, under the legal centralization process, it requires a referenda in each district. So I guess where that ends up usually is that there are going to be winners and losers if you're too far apart, and you're not going to get a referenda passed most likely in the school district where they're going to have to pay more taxes to go into a merged arrangement. Phil's the real expert on this, and he's coming up next. See how deftly I just passed that off to Phil. So what I do is just put a few up here which are illustrative. These are some districts where I think it could work. Okay, that are in the field of play, that are contiguous to one another. I do question when you bring, okay, let's take these two districts. Are they going to be large enough when you combine the two that you're still going to get the efficiency of scale that you're looking for? Another one that might work. Okay, but for every one I've put up here, there are many more that would not work. I just had Parishville Hopkinton up there, which I think was $12 in the neighborhood. Okay, so Parishville Hopkinton and one of its larger next door neighbors, Potsdam, $22 per thousand. Parishville's $12. Never going to happen. Back to Keith's question. You can't convince me that people in the community of Parishville Hopkinton would vote to see their taxes increased that drastically, and again, blowing all of the incentive monies towards simply equalizing the tax rates and not really gaining efficiencies or improving programs in the districts. So regional high schools, knowing that the mergers have not been successful, as John said, and I'm in a similar position to John, where if I'm called upon by state ed, I have to be agnostic as to the method. Again, it's a district choice, it's a local choice, but might not a new way and some new legislation be needed to get at this issue of keeping, for instance, K-6 buildings in towns so that the kind of drift doesn't occur that John talked about. This is the local bill. I mentioned that 2 have passed the Senate, so this is in Western New York. This is the comprehensive. If you want to write the bill numbers down, you can look them up. This is the comprehensive bill that in fact was written by the State Ed Department and sponsored by Senator Flanagan, who's the education chair. And then this is just a phrase I stole from Senator Flanagan's bill that I think illustrates, what are we trying to do in terms of a regional high school legislation? What are some things that could be provided? As you'll notice, it does mesh a little bit with what Steve Todd talked about in some of the curriculum initiatives, especially the multiple pathways, having specialized programs like STEM, that certainly our small schools would not be able to offer as stretched as they are financially and in terms of human capital right now. Okay, back to the question that was asked. In the past, we did see some success with mergers many years ago because they allowed an area-wide referendum, which is no longer the case. There now has to be, in fact, there has to be multiple votes in each independent school district. It makes it much more difficult, especially in the age of Facebook, when people can organize electronically. Very difficult to get some of these referenda passed. So I've just put some questions up here in terms of how do we think about restructuring or reorganizing so that we're thinking about students. And so that we're thinking about not just saving money, but as Steve Todd talked a lot about college and career readiness, how can we design a program or a school structure where North Country students are getting what they need to get, and then making it scalable, and then making it financially possible? And I just want to point you in the direction of some other states. Contrary to the statistics the governor's using when he talks about New York being 38th in performance and first in spending on education, you can see any of the educators in the room afterwards. We dispute that figure and do some fact checking on it. When you look at Education Week, which is the most reputable national publication on educational performance, they've consistently rated Massachusetts first for many years. They were again this year. And Massachusetts, in fact, employs regional high schools and regional technical high schools, magnet schools, really. So why are we not looking there when we know they're first in performance? And actually in Education Week, the state that just bumped us out of second place, Maryland, which employs a countywide school system, and Virginia as well. And looking north, just across the border, we know that Canada, in the recent PISA rankings of industrialized countries, scoring much better than we are for a cheaper cost. They're ranking about 8th, I think, in the latest PISA study. Ontario has provincial-wide funding of schools. They've moved it to the provincial level. In so doing, they raised school performance. They raised school performance for low-wealth areas. The aggregate performance came up as well. They're doing it for more cheaply. And they also employ regional high schools. Many of you have been out, let's say, to an Ottawa Senators game out in Canada. Canada, I looked it up, has 4 regional high schools to serve that area, 2 very large ones and 2 smaller ones, including a Catholic school, which is included in the Ontario provincial model. So just something to think about in terms of how we could restructure. All right, and if you have any real specific, very difficult questions on referenda and et cetera, you got Phil Martin coming up.
Hold on for a second. Before I let Tom sit down, are there people who have specific questions about his presentation just now? We have a couple of minutes for just a question or two. Over here. Hi, David.
You mentioned this morning that you had essentially de facto regionalization through your BOCES centers. My question is, how far could you push that model? Could you push it to 80%? And in fact, just simply go that direction and not worry about the legislature.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Great question. Andy's talking about regionalizing at our BOCES Career and Tech Centers. So a couple of different responses to that, Andy. When the Rural Schools Association did this study in 2010, I think one of the important things to note about it, if you go and look at it and read the executive summary, is all of the recommendations and assumptions were made with the understanding that there would be no new buildings. So sometimes when people talk about mergers, regional high schools, et cetera, they think, okay, there's going to be an $80 million new super regional high school built. I spoke this morning about the enrollment declines, okay, from 26,000 down to 16,000. So what Dr. Kiley and Dr. Sweeney found then is that you could locate 6 regional high schools within the existing 18 school buildings. We've lost that many students that we have space out in the component districts. Andy, as to us being able to do it at the Career and Tech Centers, one of the downfalls of having popular programs and highly